Before they fell in love, they signed a contract. Choices vanish quickly when you're poor, when your mother is dying, and when your father leaves behind more debt than memories. My father had built an empire on the unstable sand of borrowed money and hollow promises, and when the financial tide finally came in to wash it all away, the only thing left of actual value was me, or rather, my signature. I still remember the exact day it happened. The corporate boardroom was entirely devoid of warmth, a vast expanse of frosted glass and brushed steel situated high above the bustling city, completely insulated from the noise of the streets below. My father had not even looked at me when he walked out, leaving me alone with the man who had just purchased the remaining fragments of our family's dignity. The heavy, clinical silver fountain pen that I had used to sign my name across the dotted line of the marriage agreement felt colder than the winter air outside. The metal nib had scratched heavily against the thick parchment, a harsh, unforgiving sound that echoed loudly in the quiet room. It had bound me to Blackwood Crest for one entire year, and to the man who owned it, in exchange for the clearing of my family's ruinous ledger. Blackwood Crest did not feel like a home. It was a sprawling fortress of heavy gray stone, perched precariously on the edge of the misty, rainy coast of the Pacific Northwest. Below the jagged cliffs, the ocean battered the rocks with an endless, rhythmic fury, sending plumes of freezing spray high into the air. Inside, the estate was a monument to sterile, untouchable luxury. Everything was constructed of polished marble, dark, heavy mahogany, and expansive glass windows that offered no comfort, only a terrifying panoramic view of the gray, isolated world beyond. It was a place explicitly designed to keep the world out, but for me, it only served to lock the crushing isolation in. Late autumn had already turned bitter, bleeding slowly into a snow-heavy winter. The storm outside rattled the thick window panes, creating a low, constant hum of howling wind and driving sleet. The dining room was cavernous, lit by the pale, fragmented glow of a massive crystal chandelier that seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it. I sat quietly at one end of a long, polished dining table, a massive piece of furniture large enough to host a banquet of 20 people. At the far end sat my husband, Julian Vance. We did not speak. The silence in the room was not the peaceful, comforting quiet of a shared life. It was a physical weight, thick, suffocating, and heavily loaded with unspoken boundaries. Julian was a man carved from winter stone. His dark hair was immaculately swept back, his sharply tailored charcoal suit acting as a flawless shield against any semblance of human vulnerability. He ate with mechanical, deliberate precision. The heavy silver cutlery barely made a sound against the pristine white porcelain of his plate. He did not look at me. He rarely did. To him, I was not a wife, nor a companion. I was a ledger entry that had been successfully balanced, a financial debt settled, a highly inconvenient problem neatly filed away to protect his public image. Martha Finch, the housekeeper, moved through the deep shadows of the room with soft, silent efficiency. She was an older woman with sharp, observant eyes, the only person in the manor who moved without the rigid, terrified stiffness of the rest of the staff. She placed a plate of roasted pheasant and root vegetables in front of me, her eyes briefly meeting mine with a quiet, knowing sympathy before she retreated back into the dim corridor. The food looked flawless, perfectly arranged by a master chef, and yet it was entirely unappetizing. A sudden sharp ache bloomed deep beneath my ribs. It was a familiar, terrifying ghost, a rapid flutter in my chest that made it suddenly difficult to draw a full breath. The edges of my vision blurred momentarily, and a cold sweat broke out along the nape of my neck. Beneath the heavy oak table, my hands began to tremble uncontrollably. I slipped my left hand into the deep pocket of my wool skirt, my shaking fingers immediately finding the smooth, cool glass of the lavender oil bottle. I rubbed the pad of my thumb over the small amber vial, letting the faint, familiar scent that lingered on the threading ground my racing mind. The lavender was the only thing I had brought from my old life, a scent that belonged to a small garden my mother used to tend before she grew too weak to stand. It was the only thing in this massive, freezing house that smelled like safety. I pressed my nails into the soft flesh of my palm, focusing entirely on the hard texture of the glass, forcing my erratic, struggling heartbeat to slow its frantic rhythm. I could not show weakness here. I would not allow Julian to see me break. Is the allowance sufficient? Julian's voice cut through the heavy silence like a steel blade through silk. It was deep, resonant, and entirely devoid of any emotional inflection. He did not raise his head from his meal. I carefully removed my hand from my pocket and stared down the incredible length of the table. The physical distance between us was measured in feet, but psychologically, it felt like a vast, uncrossable ocean. He had asked the question not out of a husband's care, but out of a CEO's clinical need to ensure his contractual obligations were being adequately met. It is more than enough, I replied, forcing my voice to remain perfectly steady, masking the lingering tremor in my chest. Thank you. If there is anything else you require for the estate, inform Martha. She handles the accounts for the domestic staff. He finally lifted his gaze, his eyes meeting mine down the length of the polished wood. They were a striking, pale gray, resembling the surface of a frozen lake under a bleak winter sky. There was no active cruelty in them, but there was absolutely no warmth either. It was a look of absolute, terrifying emptiness. A massive wall of ice, built thick and high, designed to withstand any attempt at an emotional siege. I require nothing, I said quietly, holding his gaze without flinching. He nodded once, a curt, efficient dismissal, and returned to dismissal, turned to his meal, as if our brief interaction had never occurred. A different kind of woman might have demanded his attention. Her kind of woman might have stood up, thrown her expensive crystal wineglass against the massive stone fireplace, or screamed into the cavernous silence, just to prove she existed, just to force a reaction out of him. But I had learned long ago that dramatic anger was a luxury I could simply not afford. My dignity was the only currency I had left to my name, and I absolutely refused to spend it on a man who had only purchased my physical presence. Instead of forcing myself to eat, I picked up the heavy white cloth napkin resting on my lap. With slow, deliberate movements, I folded it, first in half, smoothing the thick, expensive linen with the flat of my palm, pressing out the unseen creases. Then again, bringing the edges together to form a perfect, sharp triangle. I aligned the corners with meticulous care, letting the simple geometric ritual completely consume my focus. When it was flawless, I placed the sharp triangle gently over my untouched plate. It was a silent sign of my complete resignation. Not a word of protest, not a tear of frustration, just a quiet, geometric boundary drawn between us in the cold room. I stood up, the wooden legs of my chair scraping softly against the thick Persian rug. Julian paused, his silver fork hovering an inch above his plate. But he did not look up. I am retiring for the evening, I said to the empty space between us, my tone perfectly even. Good night, Clara, he murmured, the words sounding entirely hollow, a polite reflex rather than a genuine wish for my rest. Good night, Julian. I turned and walked away, the heavy double doors of the dining room closing behind me, with a soft, definitive click that sealed the silence back inside. The main hallway was deeply shadowed, smelling of beeswax, old wood, and distant rain. As I walked toward the grand staircase, wrapping my arms around myself for warmth, I passed the locked door of Julian's private study. I knew that somewhere inside that room, he kept a small wooden box, the cedarwood chest, though I did not yet know what ghosts he kept locked away in the dark. I only knew that Blackwood Crest was a house entirely populated by phantoms, and I was just the latest one hired to haunt its halls. The next morning, the rain did not fall in violent sheets. Instead, it hung in the air like a fine gray mist, clinging to the coastal pines and slicking the winding asphalt roads with a cold, reflective sheen. I sat quietly in the back of the hired black car, watching the towering, wrought-iron gates of the estate disappear into the dense fog behind me. The physical transition from the isolated, sterile grandeur of the manor to the wet, bustling streets of the small, working-class harbor town was jarring, yet deeply necessary. Dr. Arthur Pendleton's medical clinic sat on a narrow, uneven street smelling strongly of sea salt, diesel exhaust, and wet pavement. It was an old, slightly weathered brick building, entirely ordinary and comfortably worn, completely lacking the polished marble, hushed acoustics, and silent servants of my husband's intimidating world. The small waiting room smelled faintly of peppermint tea and old paper, a specific, unassuming scent that immediately loosened the tight, anxious knot in my chest. When I was finally called back, I sat alone in the small consultation room, my hands resting heavily on the surface of his desk. It was a severely scarred wooden table, its edges worn completely smooth by decades of anxious patience gripping its sides, while bracing for terrible news. I slowly traced the deep, irregular grooves in the wood with my index finger, mapping the imperfections in the grain, finding a strange, profound comfort in something so visibly flawed and heavily used. Arthur walked in, a thick manila folder gripped tightly in his hands. He was a deeply kind man, his face lined with the heavy weariness of someone who spent his entire life carrying the grief of others. He sat down heavily in his worn leather chair, setting the folder on the scarred wood between us. He didn't open it immediately. He just looked at me across the desk, his eyes full of a soft, devastating pity that made my stomach drop. "The latest echocardiogram scans came back, Clara," Arthur said, his voice incredibly gentle, carefully stripping away any of his usual clinical detachment. My finger paused entirely on a deep scratch in the wood. "And the deterioration is progressing significantly faster than we initially anticipated." He sighed, leaning forward, resting his forearms heavily on the table. "The current medication is only managing the surface symptoms at this point. The severe shortness of breath, the tremors in your hands, the overwhelming fatigue. They are going to become much more frequent and much more severe. The mitral valve is failing." I nodded slowly, carefully withdrawing my hand from the table and placing it firmly in my lap, hiding the slight, involuntary shake in my fingers. It was the exact same congenital heart condition that had slowly suffocated my mother, turning her from a vibrant, constantly laughing woman into a fragile, hollow shell confined to a sterile hospital bed. I had always known this specific ghost was waiting for me in the dark. I just hadn't expected it to arrive at my door so soon. "There is a surgical option," Arthur continued, finally opening the folder and tapping a heavily highlighted page. "A complete valve replacement. But given the current, fragile state of the surrounding tissue, it is exceptionally high risk. The recovery process would be grueling, demanding, and incredibly painful. And even then, Clara, there are no absolute guarantees. I understand the risks. If you want to proceed, we need to schedule the operation within the next 2 months. Any later than that, and the risk of catastrophic heart failure becomes far too high to safely operate." Arthur studied my face intently, desperately searching for a break in my stoic composure, a tear, a gasp, anything. When he found absolutely none, his brow furrowed in deep concern. "Clara, you cannot possibly do this alone. The recovery alone will require round-the-clock, intensive care. You need to contact your husband." "No." The single word left my lips before he had even finished his sentence. It was spoken softly, but it carried the absolute unyielding weight of solid stone. Arthur blinked, clearly taken aback by the speed and finality of my rejection. "Clara, Julian Vance is your husband. He has the immense financial resources, the private medical facilities, the ability to hire the best specialists in the country. Julian Vance is a man who signed a legal contract to acquire a quiet, unobtrusive presence in his massive home," I interrupted, my voice perfectly level, refusing to let the emotion bleed through. "He paid off my father's massive debts to save his own corporate acquisition strategy. I agreed to a strict, 1-year marriage of convenience. That is the entirety of our relationship. There is nothing more. This isn't about legal contracts or corporate acquisitions, Clara. This is about your life. And my life is the one single thing I still own." I looked down at the scarred wooden table, my vision blurring slightly as a wave of sheer exhaustion washed over me, though I absolutely refused to let the tears fall. I traced another groove, pressing my nail hard into the worn grain to anchor myself to the present moment. "I will not tell him, Arthur. Not because I am foolishly proud, and not because I want to suffer in silence, but because I refuse to become a burden of pity in a house that already barely tolerates my existence." Arthur rubbed his temples, his objective medical training fiercely warring with his profound human empathy. "If you go through this major surgery and it fails, or if the complicated recovery goes poorly, you will be entirely alone." Mine was quiet, like a held breath that no one dared to release. I murmured, staring blindly at the worn wood, the haunting words slipping out as I clearly remembered the long, agonizingly silent night sitting alone in my mother's hospital room, listening to the rhythmic beep of the machines. I looked up at Arthur, meeting his weary, worried gaze. I will not use my failing heart to desperately extract emotion from a man who bought me. If Julian ever looks at me, I want it to be because he actually sees me, not because he pities a dying woman. I will not trade on his guilt to survive, and if the absolute worst happens during the procedure, then I will quietly leave the estate before I become a medical inconvenience to his staff. I will go to the surgical center alone. If I wake up, I will slowly recover, return to Blackwood Crest, and silently finish out the remaining term of my contract. If I do not wake up, then Julian will simply have one less contractual obligation to manage. Arthur leaned back heavily in his chair, a long, defeated sigh escaping his lips. He had known me long enough to recognize that arguing with my stubbornness was entirely futile. I had survived the complete collapse of my family, the agonizing death of my mother, and the humiliating, public auction of my future by erecting an impenetrable fortress of quiet dignity. I was certainly not going to tear it down now just because I was terrified. I am scheduling the surgery for the second week of January, Arthur said, his tone shifting reluctantly back to that of a focused physician, though the deep sadness in his eyes remained. You have exactly 6 weeks to prepare your affairs. I will prescribe a much stronger beta blocker to help manage the tremors and the severe palpitations, but you need to know it will make you incredibly, debilitatingly fatigued. Thank you, Arthur, for everything. He quickly wrote out the prescription, the rough, hurried scratch of his cheap pen against the paper providing a stark, jarring contrast to the heavy, smooth, clinical glide of the silver fountain pen that had signed my life away months ago. He reached across the desk and handed me the small slip of paper. Clara, he said softly, his voice catching slightly as I stood up and smoothed the front of my wool coat. You don't have to carry the weight of the entire world in complete silence. Sometimes, letting someone else carry the burden with you is the bravest thing you can possibly do. I gave him a small, fragile smile, tightening my grip on the handle of my purse. I will see you in January, Arthur. I walked out of the warm, quiet clinic and stepped back into the freezing coastal mist. The damp, heavy air filled my failing lungs, feeling incredibly sharp and cold. I climbed back into the waiting hired car, giving the silent driver a brief nod to begin the long return journey to Blackwood Crest. As the heavy vehicle navigated the treacherous, winding mountain roads, I reached deep into my coat pocket, my trembling fingers once again finding the lavender oil bottle. I didn't unscrew the cap. Just holding the small, solid object in the darkness was enough to keep me from falling apart. I was willingly returning to a sprawling house of ice, carrying a devastating secret that was quite literally breaking my heart. But as the towering, forbidding iron gates of the estate finally came back into view through the dense fog, looming in the distance like the bars of an elegant, inescapable cage, I forced myself to sit up and straighten my posture. I would not shrink into the shadows. I would not beg for an ounce of affection. I would face the crushing cold with my head held high, drawing my physical and emotional boundaries in total silence, folding my terrifying fears away as neatly and precisely as a white linen napkin. The new beta blockers made the nights impossibly long. My heart beat with a forced, sluggish rhythm, a medically induced lethargy that left my limbs feeling like they were made of heavy lead, yet my mind absolutely refused to quiet down. I lay in the massive, canopied bed, staring blindly up at the dark, vaulted ceiling of my assigned chamber. The violent storm outside had slowly shifted from a furious, battering howl to a steady, rhythmic drumming against the thick window glass. It was a natural sound that usually offered a sense of deep comfort. But tonight, the relentless rain only amplified the profound emptiness of the sprawling Blackwood Crest estate. Every drop against the pane felt like a ticking clock, counting down the precious few weeks I had left. I slid out from under the heavy down comforter, unable to endure another hour of lying perfectly still in the suffocating dark. The polished marble floor was shocking against my bare feet, sending a sharp, stinging ache up my calves that forced a small gasp from my lungs. I pulled my thick wool robe tightly around my shoulders, knotting the belt with trembling fingers. I needed a glass of water, but more importantly, I desperately needed to move. The absolute silence of the manor at 3 a.m. was oppressive, thick with the weight of unseen ghosts and unspoken, rigid rules. The shadows seemed to cling to the walls, whispering of isolation and cold transactions. As I navigated the deeply shadowed corridor, guiding myself by tracing my fingertips lightly along the cold, silk-lined wallpaper, I noticed a faint disruption in the absolute dark. A single, thin sliver of warm amber light bled across the dark mahogany floorboards at the far end of the long hall. It spilled outward from the slightly ajar door of my husband's private study. I should have turned around immediately. I should have respected the strict, geographical boundaries of our transactional marriage and walked back to my cold room. But some places don't wait to be found. They call to you in silence. I stepped closer, the thick Persian runner, swallowing the faint sound of my footsteps entirely. I pushed the heavy oak door open, just a fraction of an inch further, holding my breath as the hinges yielded without a sound. The room smelled intensely of sharp cedarwood, aged paper, and bitter scotch, a rich, masculine scent that felt incredibly heavy in the stale air. A solitary brass reading lamp burned on the massive desk, casting long, wavering shadows against the towering walls, lined with thousands of unread books. And there, slumped deeply into the corner of a high-backed leather chair, was Julian. He was asleep. It was the very first time I had ever seen him without his immaculate, terrifying armor firmly in place. His dark hair fell loosely across his forehead, completely stripped of its severe, calculated precision. The harsh, deeply etched lines of authority around his mouth had softened into a look of profound, exhausting defeat. He looked utterly hollowed out, a man quietly crumbling under a massive, invisible weight that he refused to let anyone else carry. The ruthless tycoon who had bought my life with a stroke of his pen was nowhere to be seen. On the polished wood of the desk in front of him, resting directly in a pool of golden light, the cedarwood chest sat wide open. His large, pale hand was resting protectively near its base, his long fingers loosely curled around a small, faded object. It was a fragile, braided ribbon, the kind used to tie back a young girl's hair, its once bright color long washed away by time and thick dust. Beside the delicate heirloom lay a neatly bound stack of old, unposted letters, their edges yellowed, frayed, and heavily worn from years of silent handling. My breath caught in my throat, a tiny, involuntary sound born of sheer surprise. It was barely a whisper against the mechanical ticking of the room's grandfather clock, but, in the absolute stillness of the study, it was more than enough. Julian's eyes snapped open. The rare vulnerability vanished so quickly, it was as if it had never existed at all. The soft, broken man disappeared, immediately replaced by the ruthless CEO, who bought failing companies and desperate people with equal, clinical detachment. He sat up rigidly, his broad shoulders tensing, his pale gray eyes locking onto mine with a sudden defensive fury that made the air in the room drop by 10 degrees. "What are you doing in here?" he demanded, his voice dropping into a low, dangerous register designed entirely to intimidate, to push the perceived threat away before it could get too close. He quickly swept the braided ribbon back into the small wooden box, snapping the heavy lid of the cedarwood chest shut with a harsh, violent crack that echoed sharply off the high ceiling. "This room is strictly off limits, Clara." I made the boundaries of this arrangement abundantly clear. He was actively trying to frighten me. He was raising a massive wall of sharp ice to frantically cover the raw, bleeding shame of being caught in a moment of pure human grief. I looked down at his hands. They were resting flat against the polished surface of the desk, but his knuckles were stark white, and a very faint, almost imperceptible tremor shook his left wrist. The imposing billionaire was not angry. He was absolutely terrified of being seen. I did not apologize. I did not shrink back into the cold shadows of the hallway, and I did not offer a frantic, stammering excuse for crossing his ironclad boundary. Instead, I stepped fully into the amber light of the study. I walked slowly toward the heavy, leather Chesterfield sofa, positioned near the dark, unlit fireplace. A thick, dark wool blanket, woven in a deep tartan pattern, was draped neatly over its arm. I picked it up, the coarse fabric feeling heavy, practical, and grounding in my trembling hands. I crossed the small space between us, the silence stretching incredibly tight, vibrating intensely with his unspoken anger and my absolute refusal to engage with it. Julian watched my slow approach, his posture turning rigid, a thick muscle feathering wildly in his clenched jaw. He looked completely ready to lash out again, bracing himself to deliver a crushing reprimand that would firmly reestablish his absolute control over the situation. I stopped right beside his chair. Without saying a single word, I unfolded the heavy blanket and draped it gently over his cold shoulders. I smoothed the thick wool over his collar with deliberate, quiet care, my shaking hands hovering just a fraction of an inch above his expensive shirt. I did not touch his skin. I did not offer a single word of pity, nor did I demand an explanation for the open box or the sudden cruelty. I simply performed the quiet, necessary task of offering warmth to a freezing man. Julian froze completely. The harsh reprimand died instantly in his throat, evaporating into the quiet air. His broad chest stopped moving, his breath catching sharply, as he stared straight ahead at the dark window, completely unmoored by the simple, unsolicited act of grace. The defensive fury in his striking gray eyes shattered entirely, leaving behind a stark, naked shock that made him look incredibly fragile. For a fraction of a second, the towering wall of ice cracked, revealing the devastating isolation trapped underneath. I took a slow step back, wrapping my own thin robe a little tighter around my waist to guard against the chill of the room. "Good night, Julian," I whispered to the quiet room, my voice perfectly steady despite the violent fluttering in my chest. I turned and walked out into the corridor, leaving the heavy oak door slightly ajar behind me, allowing him to keep the offered warmth without ever forcing him to explain the crushing cold. Morning arrived painfully slowly, stripping the deep shadows from the coastal estate, but offering absolutely no warmth in return. The violent rainstorm had finally broken, leaving behind a suffocating, silent freeze. Thick layers of white frost coated the massive window panes of the grand dining room, completely blurring the jagged cliffs and churning ocean outside into abstract, unreadable smudges of gray and white. I bypassed the sterile, cavernous dining hall entirely. I simply could not stomach sitting alone at the far end of that massive oak table today, pretending to exist in a normal world while my heart struggled to maintain a steady beat. Instead, I followed the faint, grounding scent of roasted oats and boiling water deep into the back corridors of the manor. The kitchen was Martha Finch's undisputed sanctuary. Unlike the rest of the sprawling house, which was built of unyielding gray stone and sterile, polished marble, this room felt heavily utilized and deeply alive. Copper pots hung from a blackened iron ceiling rack, and the vast wooden prep counters were permanently scarred from decades of careful, repetitive, and loving labor. It was a space designed for genuine nourishment, not calculated displays of wealth. The older woman looked up from the heavy cast iron stove as I entered. She didn't look entirely surprised to see the lady of the house abandoning the rigid formal dining protocol. With a soft, knowing nod, she gestured to a worn wooden stool tucked neatly in the warm corner by the ovens. I sat down gratefully, drawing my knees closely together, trying to ignore the deep, hollow exhaustion pulling heavily at my muscles. The new medication was doing exactly what Dr. Arthur Pendleton had warned it would do. It was keeping my failing heart from racing dangerously, but it was turning my blood to sludge, making every physical movement feel like a monumental effort. Martha walked over and brought me a chipped ceramic mug, filled to the brim with dark, steaming tea. She placed it carefully on the worn counter in front of me. I immediately wrapped both of my hands around the thick porcelain, letting the intense, radiant heat sear directly into my freezing palms. The physical pain of the hot ceramic was a brilliant, necessary distraction from the terrifying flutter that was beginning to echo faintly behind my ribs. "He was in the study all night," Martha said quietly, her back turned to me as she methodically wiped down the long counter with a damp cloth. Her voice was barely louder than the soft, rhythmic hiss of the boiling kettle on the stove. "He rarely sleeps in his actual bed, hasn't for years." I stared down into the dark, reflective surface of my tea, watching the small tendrils of steam rise and twist into the cool kitchen air. I didn't bother to ask how she knew I had been wandering the halls. In a grand house defined entirely by its deafening silence, the staff heard absolutely everything. They read the shifting currents of the estate, long before the occupants even realized the wind had changed. He looked like he was fighting a terrible war he had already lost. I murmured, the heavy words slipping out before I could properly filter them. I traced the chipped edge of the mug with my thumb, remembering the terrifyingly blank, hollow look in his eyes right before the defensive anger took over. Martha stopped moving. She stood perfectly still for a long moment, staring blankly out the small, frosted window above the deep sink. When she finally turned to look at me, the usual professional distance in her sharp, observant eyes had melted into a heavy, profound sadness. She reached for a dry linen towel, slowly wiping her wet hands with deliberate, mechanical care. It was his younger sister, the housekeeper said, her voice dropping into a reverent, incredibly fragile register, confirming the ghosts I had felt haunting the study. She was 10 years younger than him, bright as a summer morning, and the absolute center of his entire universe. The kitchen grew painfully quiet. The only sound, the rhythmic, mechanical ticking of the wall clock, counting down the seconds. I did not move. I barely breathed, terrified that any sudden motion or misplaced word would shatter the delicate, devastating truth she was finally offering me. The faint trace of lavender from my own skin seemed to evaporate, leaving only the stark reality of inherited grief. It was a sudden, vicious illness, Martha continued, her gaze dropping to the floorboards as she pulled the painful memories from the dark corners of her mind. Something aggressive in her blood. Julian tore the entire world apart trying to save her. He bought every private hospital wing, hired the most brilliant specialists in Europe, and liquidated vast portions of his father's estate, just to secretly fund experimental treatments. He treated her failing health exactly like a hostile corporate takeover. He truly thought he could buy enough leverage to force death to back down. The older woman walked over to the table, resting her worn, trembling hand heavily on the back of an empty wooden chair. But some debts cannot be paid off, no matter how much gold you throw at the ledger. She died in terrible pain, and Julian. He sat holding her small hand in that sterile room for 3 entire days after she was gone, completely refusing to let the doctors take her away. A devastating, icy dread began to pool at the base of my spine, slowly creeping upward until it gripped the back of my neck like a physical hand. When he finally walked out of that hospital room, the boy I helped raise was completely gone, Martha whispered, a single tear escaping the deep lines of her weathered face. He came home and locked the doors. He froze his heart. He realized that loving someone meant handing the universe a sharpened knife and waiting helplessly for it to strike. So, he built a life entirely out of cold steel and paper contracts. Transactions cannot break your heart. Debts can be managed. He became cold because the alternative was bleeding to death from the inside out. The warm room spun slightly around me. The deep, agonizing parallel hit my chest with the devastating force of a physical blow. His beloved sister had died of a sudden, painful illness that no amount of massive wealth could fix. It was the exact trauma that had shattered his soul, the exact nightmare that had turned him into a living ghost, who hid in his study with a faded ribbon. And here I was, sitting quietly in his kitchen, harboring a failing mitral valve that was inevitably suffocating me from the inside. A massive, violent tremor ripped suddenly through my left arm. I gripped my hot tea mug so tightly that my knuckles turned stark, bloodless white, desperately trying to mask the violent shaking from the observant housekeeper. The heat of the ceramic burned fiercely against my skin, but I welcomed the searing pain, using the tactile shock to violently anchor my spiraling mind. My hidden pain was a mirror to his greatest tragedy. I was the very thing my husband feared most. I was a fragile, failing body, a walking medical tragedy waiting to violently tear open his oldest, deepest wounds. If I stayed in this arrangement, if I eventually collapsed in the grand hallways of this house and allowed him to watch me wither away, I would force him to relive the most agonizing failure of his entire life. I looked down at the dark liquid trembling inside the cup. Our silence didn't rush. It lingered in these quiet rooms, between unfinished words, filling the spaces where we couldn't speak. He had paid my father's massive financial debts without question. He had given me a safe, quiet sanctuary, when I had nowhere else to turn, even if that sanctuary was built entirely of ice. I owed him my absolute, unwavering protection in return. The decision crystallized in my racing mind, sharp, brilliant, and unyielding as a winter diamond. I would endure the grueling fatigue and the painful tremors in absolute silence. I would meticulously hide my worsening symptoms, my shortness of breath, and my terrifying medical files. And when the second week of January finally arrived, I would simply vanish into the freezing night. I would face the high-risk surgery completely alone, ensuring that if my flawed heart finally stopped beating on that operating table, the cold, broken billionaire who owned my contract would never have to mourn another ghost. The transition from the bitter chill of late November into the unforgiving, suffocating depths of early January was measured not in days on a calendar, but in the rapid, terrifying deterioration of my physical strength. The newly prescribed beta blockers provided by Dr. Arthur Pendleton were a crude, incredibly heavy instrument. They successfully prevented my failing mitral valve from racing into a fatal, chaotic arrhythmia, but they exacted a brutal, unrelenting toll on my waking life. My blood felt like freezing molasses, simply walking from the grand, silk-lined bedroom to the quiet, grounding warmth of Martha's kitchen became a monumental, exhausting journey. I frequently had to pause in the empty corridors, leaning heavily against the cold marble walls, gasping for shallow breaths, while the opulent, untouchable world of Blackwood Black crest spun dangerously around me. I had become a fragile ghost, haunting a fortress of heavy stone, meticulously hiding my worsening tremors beneath thick, oversized wool sweaters, and completely avoiding the sharp, observant gaze of my husband. I had planned my final departure with the precise, clinical detachment of a woman who had absolutely nothing left to lose. The high-risk valve replacement surgery was officially scheduled for the end of the week. Dr. Pendleton had been furious with my stubborn refusal to inform Julian of the impending operation, but strictly bound by the legalities of medical confidentiality, he had no choice but to comply with my absolute directives. I had formally requested a physical copy of my complete medical file, along with a comprehensive list of surgical risks and post-operative care requirements, so I could arrange my own solitary recovery in a cheap coastal motel far away from the estate. But more importantly, I had quietly contacted a discreet, independent attorney to draft a complete, irrevocable annulment of our 1-year marriage contract. I had signed the thick legal document in the dead of night, using a cheap ballpoint pen, placing it carefully inside my worn canvas tote bag, fully prepared to leave all the money, the sterile luxury, and the terrifying financial security of the Vance Vant empire entirely behind. The fatal error occurred on a Tuesday afternoon, just as a massive, blinding winter squall began to violently batter the Pacific Northwest coast. Desperate to escape the heavy, suffocating silence of the massive manor, I had retreated to the chilly glass greenhouse. It was a beautiful, isolated structure of wrought iron and frosted panes, smelling faintly of damp earth and dormant, winter vines. I sat on a weathered wooden bench, listening to the freezing rain lash against the glass overhead, seeking a moment of quiet before my impending departure, but the bitter, seeping cold violently constricted the fragile blood vessels in my chest. A sudden, massive, erratic palpitation seized me, stealing the breath straight from my lungs with the force of a physical blow. My vision blurred heavily at the edges, darkening into a terrifying tunnel of gray static. I fumbled frantically in the pocket of my oversized sweater, my trembling fingers clutching the small, cool glass vial of my lavender oil, desperately trying to ground myself in its sharp, familiar scent. It wasn't enough. The heavy glass walls of the greenhouse seemed to tilt dangerously. My weak knees buckled beneath me, and I collapsed against the damp stone floor, the cold world fading away into a suffocating, absolute silence. When I slowly, agonizingly drifted back to consciousness, the biting cold of the greenhouse was gone, replaced by the deep, resonant warmth of a crackling hearth. I was lying flat on the heavy leather sofa in Julian's private study, the familiar, grounding scent of sharp cedarwood, aged paper, and bitter scotch wrapped around me, but a sharp spike of pure terror instantly pierced through my drug-induced lethargy. The solitary brass reading lamp cast a harsh, unforgiving golden light across the polished wood of his massive mahogany desk. I kept my heavy eyelids barely open, feigning sleep, my body too weak to move, and my breath trapped painfully in my throat. Julian stood rigidly in the dead center of the room. He still wore his immaculate, tailored charcoal overcoat, his broad shoulders damp from the freezing rain outside. He had clearly found me unconscious in the greenhouse and carried me inside to safety. But in his desperate, frantic search through my canvas tote bag for my emergency medication, he had uncovered my heavily guarded secret. In his large, pale hands, he held the stark white pages of my medical history. He was staring directly at the detailed echocardiogram scans, the grim, highlighted surgical prognosis, and the freshly signed annulment papers resting at the very back of the stack. The silence in the room had teeth. It was not the usual cold, calculated quiet of his rigid corporate discipline. It was a vicious, suffocating vacuum that seemed to violently suck the oxygen straight from the stale air. I watched, utterly paralyzed and pretending to be unconscious, as the imposing, untouchable master of the estate began to physically unravel before my eyes. His broad shoulders hitched. A brutal, uncontrollable tremor seized his hands. It started deep in his wrists, a violent shaking that rapidly traveled up his strong arms with such devastating force that he could no longer maintain his grip on the heavy files. He didn't simply drop the folder. His hands completely gave out. Dozens of clinical white pages slipped from his fingers, catching the stale air of the study, and scattering wildly across the dark floorboards like broken, jagged pieces of ice. The stark black ink detailing the imminent, terrifying failure of my heart mixed indiscriminately with the cold legal clauses of our severed marriage. Julian did not bend down to retrieve them. He collapsed heavily into his high-backed leather chair, his long legs giving way, as if the bones had suddenly turned to ash. He stared blankly down at the scattered papers, his striking pale gray eyes wide, with a raw, unvarnished terror that entirely stripped away his formidable, carefully constructed pride. He pressed his burning palms flat against the sharp edge of the desk, his knuckles turning stark, bloodless white as his broad chest heaved in shallow, ragged, agonizing gasps. He was looking directly into the darkest abyss of his own past. He was watching history viciously repeat itself in the precise clinical terminology of my failing body. The ruthless tycoon who routinely bought and dismantled massive corporations was completely paralyzed by the horrifying realizations that he was about to lose someone else to a sterile, beeping hospital room. He ran his trembling hands through his dark hair, a soft broken sound tearing from his throat, a sound of pure, unadulterated devastation that broke my heart into 1,000 irreparable pieces. I pressed my hand tightly over my own mouth to stifle a sudden sob, hot tears finally spilling fast and heavy down my freezing cheeks. I had intended to protect him. I had signed those annulment papers so he could cleanly sever the legal tie before my heart finally stopped beating, ensuring he would only lose a contractual business obligation rather than a wife, not because I didn't care for him, but because I cared far too much to force him to watch me slowly suffocate. But watching him crumble into a broken, gasping shell of a man, I realized with devastating clarity that my silent, noble martyrdom had only triggered the exact psychological destruction I had desperately tried to prevent. I could not stay in this house. If I stayed, he would try to use his vast wealth to fight another, unwinnable war against death, tearing his own soul apart in the process. I had to vanish immediately, before he could rebuild his walls, before he could step out of that study and demand to take control of my fragile fate. I waited just a moment longer, until he buried his face in his large hands, completely overwhelmed by the crushing weight of his grief. Summoning every last reserve of adrenaline in my failing body, I quietly slipped off the leather sofa, letting the heavy shadows of the corridor swallow me entirely. I turned away from the amber light of the study and fled toward the servants' stairwell, my failing heart pounding a frantic, terrifying rhythm against my aching ribs. My packing took less than 5 minutes. I bypassed my tote bag in the study, opting instead for a small canvas duffel from the back of the closet. I left the expensive, tailored silk dresses hanging untouched in the massive cedar wardrobes. I pulled the heavy, flawless diamond ring from my left hand, a cold stone attached to a hollow promise, and placed it perfectly center on the dark mahogany of my vanity. I stripped off the fine wool garments provided by the estate accounts and dressed in my own worn, faded jeans and the thick, oversized cable-knit sweater I had brought from my childhood home. I packed nothing but a single change of clothes, my identification, and the small, cool glass vial of my lavender oil. As I zipped my modest canvas bag, I took one final look around the cavernous, sterile bedroom that had served as my gilded cage. I was leaving with exactly what I had brought into this transactional marriage, my quiet dignity and a failing heart. Slipping out through the heavy side doors of the conservatory, I immediately met the full unbridled fury of the Pacific Northwest winter. The storm was a violent, screaming entity. Freezing rain fell in thick, heavy sheets, instantly soaking my hair and pasting it painfully to my cheeks. The bitter wind howled through the towering coastal pines, carrying the sharp, stinging scent of crushed needles and churning seawater. The temperature was hovering just above freezing, and the thick, freezing mud of the sprawling estate grounds sucked greedily at my boots with every difficult step. Escaping the property was an exercise in pure, unadulterated agony. The heavy, biting cold caused the fragile blood vessels in my chest to constrict violently, triggering a massive, erratic palpitation that stole the breath straight from my lungs. My vision blurred heavily at the edges, darkening into a terrifying tunnel of gray static, but I absolutely refused to stop. I kept my head down, leaning my slight, trembling weight into the punishing wind, forcing one numb foot in front of the other as I navigated the long, winding asphalt driveway toward the towering wrought iron gates. I was perhaps 50 yards from the boundary of the estate when a massive, terrifying sound cut through the howling storm. The heavy oak front doors of the manor burst open, slamming violently against the outer stone walls with a crack that sounded like a gunshot. I did not turn around. I tried to run, forcing my heavy, sluggish legs to move faster, but my failing heart simply could not support the sudden, desperate demand. My knees buckled entirely, sending me stumbling forward into the slick, freezing gravel. Before I could hit the ground, before the sharp stones could tear into my palms, strong, desperate arms wrapped violently around my waist. Julian pulled me backward, spinning me around and crushing me flush against his chest. He dropped heavily to his knees in the freezing mud, pulling me down into the dirt with him. He didn't care about his immaculate, tailored trousers. He didn't care about the freezing rain soaking entirely through his expensive clothing, or the dark mud permanently staining his cuffs. The ruthless, untouchable billionaire was completely gone, entirely replaced by a terrified, shattered human being who had just run through a screaming storm to catch a ghost. He grabbed my freezing, trembling hands, ripping the canvas duffel bag from my weak grip and tossing it carelessly into the absolute darkness. The shocking, radiant heat of his burning palms felt like a physical brand against my icy skin. He pressed my small hands flat against the center of his chest, right over his violently racing heart, holding me there with a desperate, crushing grip. "You cannot do this," he choked out, his voice completely unrecognizable. It was a raw, jagged tear of sheer panic, utterly stripped of all its usual dark, resonant authority. He stared down at me, his pale gray eyes, frantically searching my face in the dark. The freezing rain plastered his dark hair to his forehead, mixing indiscriminately with the hot, heavy tears that he completely refused to hide. "You cannot leave me." I signed the papers. "Julian," I whispered, my voice incredibly faint, barely carrying over the violent roar of the ocean below the cliffs. I tried to pull my hands away, desperate to maintain the fragile emotional distance between us, but his grip only tightened, refusing to let me slip back into the cold. "The contract is void. You don't have to watch me die. You don't have to go back into that hospital room." "To hell with the contract," he whispered, his voice cracking with a terrifying desperation that shattered his absolute emotional control. He pulled me closer, burying his wet face into the thick, soaked wool of my collar, his massive frame shaking with a grief so profound it seemed to violently fracture the very air around us. The towering wall of ice had not just cracked, it had completely melted, leaving him entirely exposed to the brutal elements. "Say you're not her," he begged, the words tearing from his throat in a broken, agonizing sob that vibrated directly against my collarbone. "Say you're not going to leave me in the dark. Please, Clara, please." I was entirely unmoored. I had prepared myself for a cold, clinical demand that I return to the house to fulfill my legal obligations. I was entirely unprepared for the humbled giant, kneeling in the freezing mud, completely discarding his vast wealth, his terrifying corporate power, and his impenetrable pride just to beg for my physical presence. Sometimes love doesn't knock, it waits. It lingers in quiet rooms between unfinished words, and sometimes it breaks through the deepest, coldest trauma in the middle of a screaming storm. I stopped fighting him. I let my heavy, exhausted body collapse fully against his broad chest, my frozen fingers slowly curling into the wet fabric of his ruined coat. I looked up at the man who had bought my father's debts, the man who had built a massive fortress of ice, just to survive his own bleeding heart. His burning hands were holding on to me, like I was the single, solitary anchor keeping him tethered to the earth. In the freezing, violent rain, surrounded by the absolute darkness of the Pacific Northwest coast, the transactional boundaries of our arranged marriage simply washed away. Seen, leaving nothing behind but two profoundly broken people, desperately trying to keep each other warm. The journey back to the towering stone walls of Blackwood Crest was completely stripped of any lingering grace or rigid formality. Julian did not call for the estate security. He did not summon the drivers or the groundskeepers to assist him in the freezing, violent storm. He carried my exhausted, failing body entirely on his own, his broad shoulders shielding my face from the brutal, driving sheets of freezing rain. My cheek rested heavily against the soaked, ruined lapel of his expensive charcoal overcoat. I could hear the frantic, terrifyingly fast rhythm of his own heartbeat, hammering violently against his ribs, a stark, desperate contrast to the sluggish, failing flutter trapped inside my own chest. Every step he took through the thick, sucking coastal mud was a forceful physical rebellion against the icy detachment he had spent years meticulously building. He kicked the massive oak front doors open with the heavy heel of his ruined boot, the thick wood slamming violently against the inner stone walls with a deafening crack. The grand, cavernous foyer of the estate, usually a pristine, untouchable monument to silent wealth and sterile luxury, was instantly violated by the raw, messy reality of our shared human frailty. Freezing water poured relentlessly from his dark hair, pooling indiscriminately onto the polished marble floors. The thick, dark mud from the sprawling estate grounds stained the immaculate Persian rugs, leaving a chaotic, jagged trail of dark debris in our wake. But Julian did not spare a single glance at the ruined opulence. His striking, pale gray eyes were fixed entirely on the sweeping grand staircase, his jaw clenched so tightly that a thick muscle feathered wildly beneath his pale skin. Martha Finch appeared from the deeply shadowed corridor of the West Wing, her sharp, observant eyes taking in the catastrophic scene in a fraction of a second. She did not scream in shock. She did not ask a single useless question or demand an explanation for the mud ruining the pristine floorboards. The older housekeeper simply turned on her heel, her soft shoes making absolutely no sound against the marble, and sprinted toward the estate's central telephone line. The rigid, transactional rules of the manor had evaporated into the cold, damp air, entirely replaced by a singular, frantic mission to keep the quiet ghost of the house from finally fading away into the dark. Dr. Arthur Pendleton arrived less than 40 minutes later, his heavily weathered vehicle tearing up the long, winding asphalt driveway with reckless, uncharacteristic speed. When he stepped into my grand, silk-lined bedroom, he brought the sharp, stinging scent of medical antiseptic and wet wool with him, completely overpowering the faint, grounding trace of my lavender oil. He moved with swift, clinical efficiency, his worn leather medical bag, looking incredibly small and entirely out of place resting against the opulent, heavy-down comforter of the massive canopy bed. I drifted in and out of a heavy, drug-induced lethargy, the world blurring into soft, fragmented pieces of muted light and hushed, incredibly tense voices. But even through the suffocating fog of my failing mitral valve, the monumental shift in the atmosphere of the room was impossible to ignore. Julian stood rigidly by the tall, frosted windows, his broad back turned to the freezing glass. He had completely refused Martha's quiet, repeated requests to change out of his soaked, mud-stained clothing. The freezing water had dried into a pale, chalky dust on his expensive trousers, and his usually immaculate dark hair stood in chaotic, unpredictable angles. He watched Arthur work with the terrifying, unblinking intensity of a predator guarding a deeply wounded companion. He did not issue cold corporate directives. He did not attempt to buy a faster, easier solution with his massive wealth. He simply stood there in the shadows, absorbing the harsh, clinical reality of my fragile mortality without ever looking away. The sheer physical exertion in the freezing temperatures has severely strained the remaining integrity of the valve, Arthur said softly, his weary eyes fixed entirely on the rhythmic, erratic lines of the portable monitor he had hastily attached to my chest. He turned his head slightly, addressing the stoic billionaire standing silently in the dark. She cannot wait until the end of the week. The surgical team must be mobilized immediately. But moving her to the city hospital in this violent weather, the transport alone could easily trigger a catastrophic failure. She is not leaving this estate, Julian replied, his voice dropping into a low, resonant register that vibrated heavily with absolute, unyielding authority. It was not the cold, dismissive tone of an untouchable CEO. It was the fierce, terrifying vow of a man who absolutely refused to surrender to the dark again. I will bring the hospital to her. I have already dispatched the private helicopters, the surgical team, the necessary equipment, the entire cardiac unit. They will land on the South Lawn at dawn. Until then, Arthur, you will keep her breathing, and I will not leave this room. Arthur administered a heavy dose of intravenous stabilizers, his gentle hands working with practiced, quiet grace. Once my erratic pulse had finally settled into a slow, shallow, but consistent rhythm, he retreated to the adjoining sitting room to coordinate the incoming medical logistics. The heavy mahogany door clicked softly shut, leaving Julian and me entirely alone in the cavernous, dimly lit chamber. The screaming storm outside slowly began to lose its violent fury, fading gently into a steady, rhythmic drumming against the thick glass panes. It was the exact same quiet, melancholic sound that had always amplified my crushing isolation in this house. But tonight, the heavy silence of the manor had fundamentally shifted. It was no longer a cold, sterile vacuum designed to keep the dangerous world out. It had become a heavily fortified sanctuary, fiercely guarding the fragile life lingering inside it. Julian moved slowly away from the window. He did not pull up one of the elegant plush armchairs designed for brief, polite visits. Instead, he dragged a heavy, solid oak chair across the floor, the thick wooden legs scraping harshly against the floorboards, and planted it directly beside the edge of my mattress. He sat down heavily, leaning forward until his broad shoulders hunched protectively over the pristine white sheets. A sudden, violent tremor seized my body. It was a terrifying physiological backlash from the freezing cold and the extreme prolonged cardiac strain. My hands began to shake uncontrollably, my weak fingers curling inward as a cold sweat broke out across my pale forehead. Panic, sharp and blinding, flared deep in my chest. I desperately tried to pull my arms back under the heavy comforter, wanting to hide this raw, ugly physical weakness from the man who had only ever known absolute, flawless control. I did not want him to see the fragile, broken machinery of my failing body on full display. But Julian did not look away, and he absolutely refused to let me hide. He reached out, his large, pale hands capturing my violently shaking right hand. His skin was still incredibly warm, carrying the radiant, grounding heat of a burning hearth. He did not offer hollow, empty platitudes. He did not whisper panicked reassurances that everything would magically be fine. Instead, he interlocked his long fingers tightly with mine, pressing the broad palm of his hand flush against my own. The tremor was brutal, fighting against his hold with a chaotic, desperate energy that rattled my aching bones. But Julian simply tightened his grip. He held onto my hand with a fierce, crushing desperation, his muscles locking entirely as he used his own vast physical strength to manually stabilize my shaking frame. He held on so tightly that his knuckles turned stark, bloodless white under the pale amber light of the bedside lamp. I watched, my heavy, exhausted eyes completely mesmerized, as deep, dark purple bruises slowly began to bloom across the delicate skin of his fingers. He was physically hurting himself just to keep me grounded. He was willingly absorbing the violent, terrifying shockwaves of my failing heart, using his own body as an anchor to keep me tethered to the earth. The ruthless tycoon who had once demanded a sterile, motionless contract was now quietly bleeding into the silence, offering up his own physical pain as a silent, unwavering vow of devotion. I stopped fighting the tremor. I let my exhausted muscles go completely slack, surrendering the last, stubborn fragments of my guarded pride to the quiet, devastating safety of his bruised hands. Morning came quietly. No trumpets, no shift in the universe, just a pale beam of light slipping through the tall windows, brushing against my shoulder like a second thought. But that morning was not simply the dawn of my high-risk surgery. It was the dawn of an entirely different lifetime. The transition from the bitter, terrifying winter into the soft, forgiving warmth of late spring was not measured in calendar pages, but in the slow, agonizing, and ultimately triumphant healing of my shattered chest. The valve replacement had been a brutal, exhaustive war waged within the sterile, temporary operating theater Julian had built directly inside the estate, but I had not fought that war alone. When I had finally opened my heavy eyes, days after the anesthesia had pulled me into the dark, the very first things I saw was Julian, sitting in the exact same wooden chair, his fading bruised fingers still wrapped protectively around my own. Months passed. The sprawling, sterile fortress of Blackwood Crest, with its cold marble floors and echoing, cavernous dining halls, had been quietly left behind. We had retreated to the small, rustic coastal cottage located on the far southern edge of the vast property. It was a beautiful, unassuming space built of weathered cedar wood, soft linen curtains, and warm, natural sunlight. The oppressive, clinical luxury had been entirely stripped away, replaced by the deep, resonant comfort of a simple, heavily shared existence. I sat quietly in a deep, woven wicker chair in the bright sunroom, the large glass doors pushed wide open to let in the salty, crisp breeze of the Pacific Ocean. The scent of damp earth and blooming coastal pines filled the warm air, completely washing away the sterile ghost of medical antiseptic. I reached up, my fingertips lightly tracing the long, raised surgical scar that ran directly down the center of my chest. It was a thick, unyielding line of pink tissue, a permanent, physical reminder of the fragile girl I had once been. But beneath that scar, my repaired heart beat with a steady, fierce, and undeniable strength. The terrifying flutters and the suffocating exhaustion were entirely gone, replaced by a quiet, vibrant rhythm that finally belonged to me. The soft, familiar sound of boiling water and ceramic touching wood drifted into the sunroom from the small rustic kitchen. A few moments later, Julian appeared in the narrow doorway. He was completely unrecognizable from the cold, winter-stone billionaire I had met in that sterile corporate boardroom a lifetime ago. He wore a faded, soft gray wool sweater, the worn sleeves pushed up carelessly to his forearms, entirely abandoning the sharp, immaculate tailoring of his defensive armor. His dark hair was loose, catching the warm, golden light of the afternoon sun. In his hands, he carefully carried two chipped, mismatched ceramic mugs, thin tendrils of steam, rising gently into the quiet air. He walked over and handed me the heavy blue mug. The sweet, earthy scent of chamomile and raw honey instantly washed over me, a familiar, grounding ritual that had entirely replaced the cold, silent dinners of our past. I wrapped both of my hands around the warm ceramic, looking up into his striking pale gray eyes. There was no ice left in them. The massive, terrifying walls he had built to survive, his own grief had completely melted away. They were entirely open now, reflecting a profound, hard-won peace that made my newly healed breath catch softly in my throat. Julian sat down on the low wooden stool beside my chair, his knees brushing gently against my own. He set his tea on the small side table and reached deep into the pocket of his faded sweater. The silence in the sunroom was not the heavy, suffocating vacuum of our early marriage. It was a warm, living thing, comfortable and deeply safe. This story doesn't rush. It lingers in quiet rooms, between unfinished words, in the spaces where love is found without being spoken. He slowly withdrew his hand, holding a heavy antique object. It was a silver pocket watch, the ornate metal casing, heavily worn smooth by decades of anxious, repetitive handling. The delicate engravings along the outer edge were faded, and the heavy silver chain clinked softly in the quiet room. This belonged to my late mother. Julian said, his voice a low, gentle rumble that blended seamlessly with the distant, soothing sound of the ocean waves crashing against the cliffs. It has been locked inside my desk for over 20 years. I despised it. I despised exactly what it represented. He looked down at the heavy silver object, his thumb lightly tracing the polished glass face. A watch only does one thing, Clara. It measures the relentless, unforgiving passage of time. And for a very long time, I believed that time was nothing but a vicious thief. I believed that every passing second was just another tiny fraction of a moment, stealing the people I loved away from me, pushing them closer to the dark. So, I locked the time away. I froze my life. I built an empire of stone and paper because stone doesn't age, and contracts do not have a heartbeat. He reached out, his warm, large hand gently taking my smaller, slightly trembling one. He turned my hand over, exposing my open palm, and carefully placed the heavy, antique silver pocket watch right in the center of it. The metal was incredibly warm, carrying the ambient heat of his own body. Through the thick silver casing, I could tackle the intricate, mechanical ticking of the ancient gears inside. It was a steady, rhythmic, unrelenting pulse that mirrored the very beating of my own chest. But sitting in that wooden chair, watching you fight to stay in this world, I realized that I had it entirely backwards. Julian whispered, his pale eyes lifting to meet mine. Entirely stripped of any remaining pride, fear, or defense, he gently folded my fingers over the heavy silver watch, enclosing it safely within my grasp. Time is not a thief, Clara. It is a gift. Every single tick of this watch is another breath you get to take. It is another quiet morning, another cup of tea, another day. I get to sit exactly right here beside you. I don't want to freeze the world anymore. I want to measure every single beautiful second I have left with you. A single hot tear slipped quietly down my cheek, dropping onto the worn wool of my sweater. I didn't wipe it away. I didn't need to fiercely hide my tears to preserve my dignity anymore. I leaned forward, resting my forehead gently against his broad shoulder, breathing in the deep, familiar scent of cedarwood that now meant absolute, unwavering safety. He wrapped his strong arms around me, holding me securely against his chest. I could hear the slow, powerful, and steady beating of his heart beneath the soft fabric of his sweater, syncing perfectly with the quiet, mechanical ticking of the silver pocket watch resting safely in my hands. The heavy, clinical, silver fountain pen that had bound us together in a transactional nightmare had been locked away forever. The legal annulment papers I had signed in the dark had been torn into 1,000 meaningless pieces and burned in the hearth long ago. We were no longer a debt paid, a contract managed, or a tragedy waiting to repeat itself in the silence. We were just two people who had survived the freezing storm, choosing to stay together in the quiet, unfolding warmth of the light. Home isn't a place or a name, it's a person. And as the last golden light of the spring afternoon wrapped us in its gentle, forgiving glow, I knew without a single shadow of a doubt that I had finally, truly come home. If this quiet story found a safe harbor in your evening, please take a moment to leave a like and subscribe to sit with us again.